Hey everybody, welcome to our webinar today. This is Jimmy Beach. This exposure webinar is going to focus on creating fine art images. So within the next few minutes, I'll take you through editing in exposure for applying that type of look. Now, fine art creatives use post-processing to help their work express the ideas that they have for each shot. So it's more of a creative process. This is a little different than event coverage like portraits or landscapes, or event coverage or portraits or landscapes, because the effects from fine artwork are often much stronger in appearance. And so, let me tell you a little bit about exposure as we let everybody else chime in or join us today. Exposure is our advanced, non-destructive raw photo editor and organizer. A quick history lesson about exposure is that about 15 years ago, a little bit more, exposure was developed for film photographers. And the transition from developing analog film in the darkroom with chemicals to processing digital images in the computer was tough for photographers to wrap their head around, and exposure's accurate film emulation presets essentially gave those film photographers their much loved films back. And that's really where it's got its start, and from there it's developed into what it is today. So as we get into the demonstration, I do want to point out that there will be time at the end reserved for answering questions. If you don't feel like you, or if you want to chime in, you can. If I don't answer it when I'm doing the demonstration, I will make sure and do it at the end. I also want to give a big thanks to Karen for sharing the images and her basic process with me here. And so, Karen, you are #awesome. Okay, without further ado, let's talk about fine art processing. Okay? And so, let me reset that. So I have a bunch of TIFF files here. These have not been edited. They're essentially just straight raw out of the camera from Karen. And so fine art processing is a huge topic, as it can involve as much or as little of actually performing editing on the images. So you could slap a preset on your image and be done with it, or you can painstakingly build up layer after layer to have a deeply textured look with dozens of overlays. Now, there are a few steps in the workflow that we'll talk about, but before we do that, I want to let you all know that we have detailed tutorials about each of the tools in exposure on our website that we'll be using today. So any of the tools that we have and we use, don't feel like you have to completely keep up. We have extra tutorials on our website for each one. Oh, also, there are really easy ways to find those, and that's through the owner's manual, which is right in the product. So if you go to the help menu, the manual is right here. And inside the manual are links to some of those videos that could help you out. So really good resource there. So always go there if you have any questions. All right, so we're going to begin our editing process. Okay, so first step in the process is usually, if not always, the basics. So just like with any other processing, you start with the basics and you make, adjustments to exposure, highlights, the things that are on the basic panel essentially. These adjustments, those are the ones that you really go with first whenever you take images into the computer and you start to do some editing on them. Now, you can do that by hand on each one of the images, like I said before, but for the sake of time, I'm going to use exposure's auto functionality, or auto levels, or auto adjustments. And so because the auto adjustments in exposure apply intelligent corrections to the images, I can, in fact, select a bunch of images here and apply this all at once, or I apply my auto settings all at once. So I'm going to hold down Shift. I have all of these images selected. I will hit Auto. And we'll see that they've all made some changes. Okay. Now, because I have the group selected here, I want to point out that the edits that have been applied to each one of these images is actually different. So I have this image here in particular selected, And you can see that it has an exposure value of 0.67 that was added with our exposure adjustment from the auto function. And if I go down to another image, let's say, that one has a little bit of a different number here in exposure. So anyway, the point that I'm making here is that this is applying different edits to all these images. So right now in a workflow scenario, I know that I'm going to be adding multiple layers to this, to my edits on all of these images, because these are fine art edits that we'll be making, right? So I'm going to rename the base layer with all of the adjustments we just put on I'm going to rename them all basic edits. So because I did that, I have all the images selected, so I won't have to do that a bunch of times. Okay, so I've deselected all of my images now. So we just applied our basic edits, and we have it in their own layer. Okay. Now, I'm going to zoom in on an image here. Okay, full screen. Now, typically, the next stage in the process is to utilize presets or to get yourself going in applying some sort of a look to the image, right? And so we are doing fine art this time, and I'm actually really excited about it because, okay, so before I begin, I'm getting ahead of myself because I'm really excited, as you can tell. Everybody has favorite presets whenever they're working in exposure. Everybody develops a list of favorite presets, except for me, because I wanted to demo what happens when you don't have favorite presets today. Whenever you work inside of exposure, there's typically a selection of presets that you have, such as the ones that I point out when I'm working on portraits or when I'm doing some landscapes or something like that. This time, I will be able to use some presets that I don't really get to use, and that would be like vintage black and white looks, for example. I don't normally get to do that kind of stuff because a vintage black and white look, let's say, if I'm shooting, or if I shoot a wedding, I'm editing those pictures. Vintage black and white look in wedding photography, if they're dressed appropriately with some old clothes, it'll look great, but other than that, I wouldn't really go with that. Maybe the coloring, but I don't know if I'd want to make it look vintage. Anyway, vintage looks great on these. So I go inside. These are color films vintage. I'm going to go to the black and white vintage category. I don't really get to use these type of presets very much, and man, they look really cool. So as we're going through and taking a look at these different presets that we have available, these are much stronger, okay? Like they do a lot of change to the image. So you can see what the original image looks like if I don't hover over a preset. But then if I select like this daguerreotype, you can see it's very extreme. The contrast here is very extreme. So there are a couple of reasons that I really like these vintage black and white looks, especially on like flowers like this or objects like that, that we can make look vintage. And that's because, well, there's a couple of reasons. One is that I used to shoot real black and white analog film and develop it in the dark room and all that stuff with chemistry, and it was lots of fun. And so the tonal contrast that I'm seeing in these vintage settings or in these film looks is really what's catching my eye, I think. And funny point is that as I spoke with Karen about that, it was the exact same thing that she said. So I'm not the only crazy one. Anyway, and two, it's not often that I get to use the distressed look. So calotype or these lith presets really have some sort of a distressed or noisy, grainy look that has a lot of things going on in it. And so I've been hovering over these and looking at them as I've been talking, and I actually really like this purple tone that's pulled up here with this lith infrared preset. So we already renamed, before I select this preset, we already renamed our layer over here, basic edit. So I'm just going to select this lith preset and just make it in a new layer, drag it over there like that. Okay, so there we go. Now let's so we've chose a preset. I'm gonna favorite it. See the little star right there? So now when I go to my favorites, it's right there. Super handy. It's really easy too. Okay, let me close this. So now we've applied our preset. That's pretty basic, pretty simple and straightforward. Okay, so we made our basic adjustments first. Now we applied our preset, and now we're gonna readjust. We got to make a little bit of tweaks to this preset to make it a little bit more fine arty and look at what it's doing to this image in particular. Okay. So as I look here, you can see that there's some noise here in the background. Or some texture. Let's say texture, not noise. Texture sounds so much nicer. Okay, so I'm going to hold down the / key, and you can see the original image there. What we have here is a green coloring with a little bit of blue in it. And green and blue, with this litho infrared preset, is apparently showing us some color noise in the background. So I think that that's a little bit distracting. So let's readjust our litho infrared preset by removing some of that noise, and then we'll see what it does to the image. We might need to make another tweak there. So we can see that, here we go, noise reduction. I'm going to just grab the color slider and turn it up. Okay, well that took all of it out pretty much. Okay, wait, there's a little bit. So yeah, that did quite a bit to clean that up. Okay, I'll turn it down again so you can see it. Yeah, that did a bunch. Okay, but also that smoothed out a little bit of the texture here on the flower. So I'm also going to do a little bit of sharpening. And I'm going to hold down the Alt button here. Just select those edges with the Alt button on the radius, and the same thing with the masking. I want to say this is essentially telling me which edges I want to select for sharpening, and that's just those edges. So obviously the edges in this view, when I hold down Alt, the white ones are the ones that are getting sharpened and the black is not. So there we go. That's a little bit better. I'll turn that off. Back on. That looks good. Okay. Yeah, much better. Okay, so went back through and did some readjusting. Okay, so the next point in the workflow is when we make edits to the image that are addressing any like distracting elements or areas that are a little bit too bright or too dark. So if you're going to apply local adjustments to fix anything or enhance anything in the photo, now is when you would do that, okay? So from this point in the workflow on, we're just adding finishing touches to the look. We are like 80% of the way there already. And I know you're probably like, are you serious? That's it? There's only a couple of steps? Yeah, there's only a couple of steps. In exposure, it's really easy. And we've been, the developers have made the product and the workflow very simple, so you can make advanced editing really quickly. So speaking of advanced editing, let's, I want to add a little bit more contrast in the center portion here, just in this very center. So I'm going to add a new layer. Then I'll select the mask here, which opens the brush panel. Now I don't really need to think about this very much because it's just going to be a little easy tweak. And I'll paint right on the center part. Now, it gives me a warning that says I have an empty brush. I'll say close. What that means is you can see here the layer thumbnail. If I hover over it, the red spot highlight in the middle, that is showing me where the effect is being applied to the image. Whoop. Okay, so this layer right now doesn't have any effects on it. So what we're going to do is we're going to add, ooh, you know what? I can just turn that to, I want to do contrast. So there we go. You can see it right in the middle. I'll turn it off and back on. And I'm not trying to do very much. What I want to do is give the perception that this in the center here, by adding this contrast, remember we just did that sharpening in our previous step right here with our litho preset. We added sharpening. Let me see it right here. So this sharpening, and then I added this contrast on top of the sharpening. And now it looks like I have a very clear area right here in the middle. And then this, like the focus begins to fall off as it comes to the outer edge of the image. Now I haven't added any kind of blurring to the image. This is doing it on its own just by adding these effects one after the other. Because the order in which we apply these effects actually do impact the way that the image reads in the end. Okay? So, now let's say we're going to actually add some finishing. We're pretty happy with the way that it's looking now. going to do some finishing. The way that we would finish something like this, I think, is to do something like a cool texture or a border effect. So one thing that we haven't been doing yet is really looking at different options. So that's something that I want to do in particular when I'm looking at these things. So I'm going to add a new layer, just like before. This one is going to be our texture. Now I'm using generic texture because I want to apply a couple of different looks to watch them. I'm going to go to the overlays panel. Now I'm going to click border. Now we have some toning. Before I turn that on, there is some toning. If we look at this image, this is not black and white, and there's actually a little bit of color here. Now because there is color, we want to consider that while we're adding our effects. So this is a grunge border. I actually went through all of the presets, and I like the grunge borders with this image in particular. Yeah, I do practice these demos. Just saying. No, I like to play around and look at the different options that you have inside of exposure. There's a lot of exciting stuff. Anyway, so let's do this one, number 1, okay? So this one's pretty cool. Actually, no, I don't like that one. Change, executive decision, there. Okay, that's actually really neat. So this border is applied, and it goes all the way around this photo. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hit escape. I want a couple of different versions of this image, okay? Typically, well, there's a couple of different ways you can do this. I can add a new layer and add a new texture, and then I can, here, I'll just do it. Why not? So I'll add a new layer. I'll add a different texture. 6. Yeah, okay. And then I can turn off this layer and turn on my other texture layer and compare the two. But that's a lot of clicking, so I'm going to do it a different way. I'll turn this texture layer back on. Now I'm going to hit escape. And then I'll right click and we'll make a virtual copy right here. Then what I can do is I can just go into this texture layer and I can change it. And that's pretty easy, right? But I want to be able to see them both on the screen. So what I can do is split my screen layout this way and hit escape because I don't have those two selected. Select there, shift, and then double click. There we go. So now we can see we have our original, I think this is texture 5, grunge 5 here. And this is, I don't know what this one is. And this one is grunge number 2. Now there is something, now when you see it in this comparison view like this, it does point out a couple of things that are really easy for me to say, yes, I like that, no, I don't like that. And that is, on this one in particular, even though I like all these details that this border has, the grunge number 5 overlay, this grunge number 2 overlay is white, and it's only white. And because it's only white, I think that it looks like it works with this composition of this shot better. Reason being, there isn't any black, this tone of black, in the center of this image. It's all toned, remember? So that's why I would say I would vote against this version here. I would vote against this border. So since I don't want that one, I can just, I'll just delete my, do virtual copy. And, oh, I deleted the wrong thing. Single view, back to just one. That was grunge 2, wasn't it? Yes. There we go. So now we have the right texture for what we're doing here. I'm just going to play around with it a little bit. I typically do this just to see like what it will do to the sides of the image, because sometimes like when you're going to, depending on where you're posting the image or where you're putting the image, there's going to be some border things that are happening there as well. So like if you're going to post this to Instagram, you might consider how you're going to place the border here. You know, you might want it to be like right out on the edge like that. And we can always flip that around too and do a little changes. Okay, cool. All right, so I'm going to say that this image right here, we've done a fine art look. We have a good I don't know, I think that reads well and it looks fancy. So it took us about 15 minutes, let's say, 10, 15 minutes. I did a whole lot of talking though. So here are a bunch of other images as well. And the reason that I'm going through this is realistically, when you're making fine art edits, you are the one that makes the decisions on what it looks like. Nobody can tell you whether it's a good thing or a bad thing because you're the one that makes that decision. So anyway, I want to let's go through the process one more time on another image, and we can show you a couple of tricks that you can use if you're going to do it there. So I'm going to use this shot. Okay. And there's a reason I want to use this shot, and this is because I get to use color film infrared. Okay, so let's open up the presets panel. Similar scenario. We did our basic edits already. You can see there's still, let me close that. You can see that the basic edits on our original layer are there. So this has already been tweaked a little bit. And I want to go to color, infrared, and then you can see these presets down here add some really fantastic coloring effects. They're very psychedelic. So I'm going to select and preset and add it in a new layer just like we did before. And then let's close that. Okay, so when you apply a preset, notice the reset icons on the layers panels here. Or I'm sorry, on the panels here on the right. So color, tone curve, grain, infrared, overlays, right? So this means there's already an overlay being applied to this image, right? Because it's giving me that little icon right there. So it's a little quick way of saying, oh, there's an overlay. Well, I don't want to put the overlay on it, so I'm going to turn that off, okay? The reason being is I want to add an overlay later, you know? And so I turn that off, and I can even turn this vignetting off as well. So now it's just some color, grain, infrared. All right. Now let's zoom in here. Infrared is really pretty in the way that it blends out greens. I'm going to hold down the backslash key so you can see the original image. So greens become this pink color, and blues are still like more of a teal, but the blues are still there and still pure. Now, one thing that I do want to notice here is here on the bark of the trees, or on the trunks of the trees, we have some pink coloring. Okay. Now that pink coloring, I'm just saying for the sake of conversation, is a little bit of a distraction to me. Well, actually, because I've meddled around with this before, and if we remove the pink coloring here, I think it'll be a little bit more impactful. Okay, so that's actually pretty simple to do, and I'm going to do that with the color constraints controls. So I select the color mask, and then come down to the color constraints, and now I want to select everything, but I want to mask just these the trunks off rather than all of the rest of the background. However, it's probably easier for me to just select the trunks of the trees. So I'm going to select the hue, and I'll hold down Shift and click a couple of times to see, to make sure that I have some of the tones the way that I want them. And now you can see where our dilemma comes up. If I click the show mask icon so we can see what the mask is doing, I actually have the trunks selected, which means our application of our effect is going on those trunks, which is not what we want. We want the opposite of that, but that's easy because we have an invert button. See? So now, if we do the show mask, we can see what we're not selecting, and that's the dark areas. So we can continue then to clean up our selection using the sliders here to modify that edge. The edge conditions or to help us select a little bit more or a little bit less of the canopy up top, right? And we can also add a little bit more of the tones in if we're not grabbing enough of them, just like here, okay? So I can also get rid of some of that noise and feather the edges just a little bit. So since we're removing a lot of the effect here instead of adding the effect, it's a little bit more lenient, just from experience. Okay, so there, turn my show mask off. Now you can see, I'm going to hold down the, I think I can disable the mask. Anyway, so you can see now, this is what our ectochrome looks like when we don't have it on the trunks, okay? Now this is a really cool look, I think. I'm going, oops, hit the wrong button. So now you can see what the image looks like here. I'll hold down the backslash key and you'll see before and after. Now there's one thing that I also think that'll work great on this image, and that is to add a cool fancy overlay, because we have the sun, and like a lens flare type thing would be very common, very realistic. So I'll add a new layer and add a light effect. Come on. There it is. Okay. Select on the light effect. Now, when you're adding light effects to images like this, or lens flares in particular, I really like the way that the color in the image works with that color infrared preset. So if I'm going to put a lens flare on, which I'm demonstrating, so I am, I don't want to use one that has another color, because then that blends with the infrared look, which kind of looks funky. I mean, if you want to go that way, you can, but for me, I'm going to stay with a pure white. Okay, so this one's white. Also, you can see right now the alignment for our overlay says stretch to fit, or stretch to fill, excuse me. So that will place this in the same location on the images, but I want to move it. So I'll select move. And then we can see that we have a couple of strong leading lines that come, ever so slightly which way. So I'm going to line up with this tree here so that this overlay, let me turn it as bright as I can, so that the axis that runs through this overlay also matches with this down here. And it's just a little bit of a tweak. Whoops. There we go. Okay. Now I want to make it bigger. And we'll move it up. Perfect. Okay, so that's way too strong. Now this is really subtle, but I thought that that motley lightness that happens over the areas that this affects was really pretty in the way that it reacts with that texture. It makes it seem like it's really glowy. Anyway, I thought that was a nice look. So, okay, so one thing that I did want to point out here is we used a preset here, this Kodachrome, or this Ektachrome preset, to give this infrared look to this photo in particular. Now, there's another image in here that this infrared look works as well, or it works on as well, but that one's a little bit tougher. And so I'm going to show you how to do that, the tricky masking on that other one, which is more of an advanced effect, whereas this one is more of a simple approach. We removed the effect, and then we hit the invert button on our mask. Okay, so let's go to this image here. Okay, this image has a lot of greens. It also has a little bit of blues in here, but it doesn't have very many reds. Okay, so because we have our basic edits applied already, I'll go to the presets panel. I'll go to the color infrared, which are not updating for some reason. And I'll select this same one because of that nice bright pink color. So I'll add that. Ektachrome IR. All right. Now, when I applied it in this scenario, we can see how the pink goes every which way inside of this image. So if we wanted to get rid of the trunks, or remove that pink from the trunks, this is how we would want to do that. It's very similar to the way we did it before with the color constraints. Now you can see already where my problems are going to come up, is when I'm selecting these hue values, they're also selecting a heck of a lot of other values in the image. See? So we really need to work with, we need to really work down which selection, or we need to really work down all of these to make the selection really crisp and clear. Is what I was trying to get to. All right, so let's see here. I did this before, and it was okay. So I'm going to turn off Show Mask. Okay, so we can see that we've already stripped out some of that selection here. So we have the pink leaves going on, and these stark, very white, very gray looking trunks in the center. Now, that is way too strong, okay? And so this is why I wanted to show this. I said this is more of an advanced technique. So we have a couple of things that are going on here that we're going to have to tweak. To make this look believable. So the trunks right here are way too white. So we actually want to blend out the effect of our Kodachrome or Ektachrome. So we're going to duplicate this, and then we're going to invert the mask. Okay, so let's show you how. I'm going to right click here. I'm going to duplicate the layer. I'm going to undo that. Okay. And then I want to copy the mask, and I want to paste the mask. But then I want to invert the mask. Okay. So now, if we turn that on and off on its own, we turned off the background. So now if we turn that on and off on its own, we can see the effect being applied to the trunk of the tree, whereas that pink being applied. Okay. And so if I have them both on, it looks like we didn't do anything, but we can take the effect that's on the tree branch or the tree trunks themselves with this second layer and then bring that down so that those blend together a little bit more realistically instead of having that really stark contrast edge. Okay, so it is actually a really quick thing to do after you do this. So I guess the very last thing that I would do to any kind of image is to add that smear or that glazing that you put, to finish that look. So a lot of the times, that's why the texture layers go on last. So you put texture on, you can put grain on last if you want to do some extensive grain. You can do, any of your overlays and things like that. That's typically why we put those on last. You can also add vignettes last to help with that, including not just black, but also white vignettes to try to tie in and things like that when you're using borders. So, okay. So, also, I did do a whole bunch of stuff today. I just wanted to point out that because this is all non-destructive in exposure, we don't have any saving to do. All of the edits that we've done here today are non-destructive. They are saved inside of sidecar files in with the folder of images. So, all right, so that concludes our demonstration today. I wanted to thank everybody for tuning in. I actually didn't go overboard like an hour like I did like the last 3 weeks. So sorry about that, everybody. But I am glad that we get to see this. I don't see any questions or anything. So if anyone has any questions, please pipe up and ask them now. I will give you a couple of comments and then we'll go from there. So yes, if you want to get in contact with other exposure users to share your tips on how you're using exposure or how they're using exposure or to show off what you've done, please do so. Join our exposures users group on Facebook. Also, if you want to post your work and share it with us as well as others, we monitor the hashtag MyExposureEdit. So if you want to post to Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or something, please use that hashtag. Actually, Instagram's the best place for that hashtag. I take all that other stuff back. Thank you all very much. We will see you again soon, and thanks for using exposure.